We're joined now by Steve Okun. He's Senior Advisor at McLarty Associates, and he joins us live right from here in Singapore. Good evening to you, Steve. It's good to see you. The G20 miss by Xi Jinping is unexplained, at least officially, but it's also the first time he's missing this summit. What signal is China sending to India and also to the attendee list, including the United States? And does it matter?
Xi Jinping has been sending the same signal and the same message for years now, and this is getting clearer and clearer. Xi Jinping does not see that China should be a part of the existing international rules-based order, which he sees as written by the West decades ago, that China should be an architect of the rules-based order. And this is very consistent in his trying to rewrite that. So he skips the G20. Instead, he focuses on the BRICS and expanding that regional grouping to one that China would be the lead architect on. You saw this with the AIIB a few years ago, that would be a competitor to the World Bank. And so now just flat out blowing off the G20 is consistent with what we've been seeing for years, which is that China wants to be the architect, not accept the existing architecture.
At the same time, Steve, Xi's absence at this summit is also going to eliminate that possibility of interaction with US President Joe Biden. There's been speculation about that for a while. Joe Biden has said he's disappointed, but these two men, they may still have an opportunity to speak in November at that meeting in San Francisco, at the Asia-Pac Economic Cooperation meeting. How consequential is this missed opportunity for these two leaders to meet at this time specifically, though?
Well, I think this is much more consequential about what it says about the Xi Jinping and Modi relationship than what it does about the Xi-Biden relationship. Well, here, where India is the host, this was India's moment to be a leader in the G20, what used to be, maybe still is, maybe not, but what certainly used to be the preeminent fashion in which the global economy would be ruled on and talked about by the key leaders. And now here you have the leader of the China for the first time ever not going to the G20 when it's hosted by Prime Minister Modi. It says a lot more about that. Now, let's see what happens if come November that President Xi comes to California, meets with President Biden there during APEC or on the sidelines of APEC. If that doesn't happen, then we'll know a lot more about U.S.-China relations. I think this is much more about China and where it fits globally, as well as the worsening relations we see between China and India, and the better relations we see between India and the United States, in Japan, in Australia, and in other countries.
Certainly, India has wanted to sort of solidify itself as the voice of the global South, as it were, and the G20 leadership at this time definitely perhaps supporting that as well. In any case, the groundwork for all of the work that's done there, the measures are generally agreed upon by member countries even before they get there. They wait for the final details, of course. But at last year's G20, hosted by Indonesia, the US president was in attendance there as well. They were able to reach consensus on quite a few issues, including language on Ukraine. Do you think that we can hold out hope for some similar outcomes this year, though?
Well, they barely last year in Bali were able to come up with some language on Ukraine. Back then, the Bali Leaders Declaration said that most members strongly condemn the war in Ukraine, but that there were other views and different assessments of the situation and sanctions. Here, I don't know if you're going to get to that agreement. There hasn't been a single communique at the 20 or so ministerial meetings that has been held by the G20 so far during India's presidency. So the situation is getting much worse. You have President Putin of Russia, who cannot go because he is considered a war criminal and could be arrested if he were in India. So you have him skipping it. Now you have Xi Jinping skipping it. So it really diminishes the the strength that the G20 used to have. And now that we see this bifurcation between China and Russia and what some might call the global South and other countries as well, with a fair mix of countries stuck in the middle and having to balance all of this.
Steve, I'd like to quickly get your take on what we're likely to see with the ASEAN bloc meetings that are about to take place in the next few days. We've got the 43rd ASEAN summit in Jakarta. That kicks off tomorrow, and it comes on the heels, of course, of China's decision to publish that new map that's been rather controversial in this area, laying out claims over the disputed South China Sea, as well as land areas contested by India and Russia as well. How typical of Chinese diplomacy is the timing of this, though? Do you see it as muscle flexing? Is it consequential?
Well, the muscle flexing has been going on for 2 decades. I mean, remember, ASEAN first laid forth how it was going to handle the disputes in the South China Sea in 2002, when it issued the declaration on the conduct of the parties there. It hasn't worked in 2 decades. So I don't think China is really concerned that they're going to time something to this meeting coming up in ASEAN, because you've seen in the past few months a much more aggressive China using force, water cannons and the like against the Philippines, against Vietnam. It's now come out with this new map that goes beyond, we've gone from the 9-dash line to the 10-dash line, which takes it even east of Taiwan. Now China claims almost all of the South China Sea. So I wouldn't be worried about the timing to the ASEAN summit. I'd be worried and concerned about what's been happening for the past 2 decades and how it has been accelerating this past year. And what is it that ASEAN is going to finally do about it?
Steve, thank you very much for your thoughts this evening. Steve Okun, their senior advisor at McLarty Associates, speaking to us from here in Singapore.